It sure is interesting how one small group of people can take one small survey done in one small county, manipulate the ever-living shit out of those numbers, and then propagate one of the biggest lies about fathers and family court I have ever heard.
The Dadvocate here is responding to one of my videos on child custody on her YouTube channel, taking issue with the idea that men who seek custody typically get it, and in particular with the Massachusetts study on gender bias, which said that 70% of those men who seek custody obtain custody. Now, Lauren's was the first account I ever blocked on TikTok, long before I ever started making videos on these topics. But I take her concerns about misinformation and accurately reporting the facts as genuine, and so I'll unblock her and tag her in this, which will be my most comprehensive video on father bias in family courts that I've ever done. And let's start out by correcting this.
You have zero stake in this game as a 40-year-old childless man, and yet here you are trying to be the hero of it by spreading lies about other men.
Now, a quick scroll through my content shows that I'm not childless. I share 50-50 custody of our son, a teenager who is on the spectrum. Now, as for my stake in this, Lauren herself admits that men are actively discouraged from seeking custody, and so I think it's on all of us to accurately report what kind of biases do exist in family court, as well as encouraging men to be involved fathers, not just at the time of separation, but when the child is born, and also afterwards when they get custody, in order to overturn the absolutely horrific rates of father abandonment. Now, Lauren has only a single source to dispute the Massachusetts gender bias study, which she presents as a paper written by Mark Rosenthal. Except that it's not a paper, it's an article that Rosenthal wrote on his own website. Rosenthal is also not a researcher, but a software engineer like myself, and he was a speaker at the International Conference on Men's Issues in 2019. And that conference is run by a Voice for Men, an anti-feminist group the Southern Poverty Law Center has declared a hate group, largely because they advocate for violence against women, and their founder Paul Elam has openly defended grape culture. So I think we need to be careful about how we represent this. It is not an independently peer-reviewed study or paper, but a blog article written by an MRA misogynist with ties to a hate group. Now, Rosenthal obtains the data that the Massachusetts study is based on, and it's important to point out here that that data set does not dispute anything that is in the Massachusetts study. When we look at fathers who ask for custody, they get sole or joint legal custody in 84% of cases. But Rosenthal is not happy with these numbers, so he fudges the math. He drops joint custody entirely from consideration and focuses only on sole custody, saying that when fathers seek custody, they get sole custody 45% of the time, but when mothers seek custody, they get sole custody 74% of the time. Which he then uses as the headline for his article, that mothers' requests for sole custody are granted 65% more than fathers' requests, or about 1 2/3. But as I've covered before, men self-report that their wives are 4 times more likely to be the primary caretaker of their children than they are. When we look at stay-at-home parents, again, mothers are 4 times more likely to be the stay-at-home primary caretaker of their children than fathers. And when we look at census data and custodial parents, again, mothers are 4 times more likely to be the custodial parent than fathers. That family courts are assigning sole custody to mothers, not at 4 times, but not even at twice the rate of fathers, shows an incredible bias towards fathers. To put this another way, men who contest custody are twice as likely to walk out of court being the primary caretaker than they were walking in. Which then brings me to Lauren's next point.
Where the study still definitively concludes that mothers get sole physical custody 65% more often than dads, only to cherry pick the facts so that only your narrative is supported, then push this as some irrefutable nationwide fact.
Now, Lauren misspeaks here and means legal custody, not physical custody. But on her other point about cherry picking a single data source, ignoring all else just to reaffirm your own narrative, it's important to remember that Rosenthal's article here doesn't dispute any of the claims that Massachusetts study makes. Not only that, but it only deals with one study. The Massachusetts report actually cites 5 studies in order to make its case. A study of law professionals that show that fathers get sole or joint physical custody 94% of the time. The Middlesex study that Rosenthal uses that shows that men get some form of legal custody 84% of the time. A second study from Middlesex County that shows that men get some form of legal custody 79% of the time. A study from LA County in California that shows that men get sole custody 63% of the time, as well as a nationwide study that shows that men get some form of custody in 51% of cases. Now, Lauren also says that the reason why Massachusetts does show a bias towards fathers is because of unique laws that it has in setting up default temporary custody orders for joint custody, and that no other state has these laws, which is why this trend isn't replicated in other states. But that's not correct. The Massachusetts study itself points to data from California and nationwide, which also shows this trend. But Massachusetts was not the only state to conduct a gender bias study. like Florida, for example. And what they found was not only a disturbing trend of fathers to contest custody, not for custody of the kids, but in order to gain an advantageous property settlement, but that when men did contest for custody, they were largely successful. Next up, Maryland, where 85% of judges said that fathers get a fair and serious hearing, where they said that anti-father bias is more a reflection of social bias discouraging men from seeking custody than any evidence of a judicial bias, and that when men did overcome this and seek custody, they got a fair and serious hearing. Not only that, but courts were actively biased towards involved fathers and gave them greater deference. Meanwhile, mothers were unfairly punished if they wanted to work or if they had a new partner, and that all these factors gave men a greater advantage and bias in family custody cases. Now on to New York, which found the same biases as Maryland, where involved fathers were given greater deference, meanwhile mothers were punished for wanting to work or having new relationships. Which is why the Civic Research Institute, when they surveyed all of the literature on child custody, pointed out that overall, over 40 states and numerous district courts had commissioned studies into gender bias, and that these had found unanimously a pervasive bias against mothers. In fact, so pervasive was this bias that when Florida's task force was commissioned to start their study, they skipped the question of if gender bias exists, saying that this has already been well established. And when taken overall, these studies show that gender bias does sometimes affect men, but it is overwhelmingly and disproportionately disadvantaging women. And we can see this lack of bias against men in more recent studies, such as this 2007 study into the 21st District Court in South Carolina. And what they found was that fathers who contested for custody got either sole or joint physical custody almost 60% of the time. Across total cases, that was 31% for fathers, so it almost doubled. But even that 31% is in line with the data from other studies, such as this custody exchange survey of hundreds of law professionals across every state in the country, which showed that on average fathers get about 35% of custody time. Now, why is that 35% and not 50? Well, I covered that extensively in that video, but in summary, it's because men don't do 50% of the childcare before the custody hearing. And all of this is before we even talk about the numerous studies that show an even greater bias towards fathers when they are accused of violence or when they accuse the mothers of alienation, and there are scores of those studies. Now, Lauren's absolutely correct when she implies that using a single data point from a single study to form a narrative would be reckless. But the reason why we say that fathers who actively seek custody are often likely to get it is because there are multiple studies from multiple states across multiple decades that show this to be true. And yet here you are, Lauren, admitting that you are struggling to find any studies that show a pervasive bias against fathers and towards mothers.